focus protection, the idea, the policy, what is focus protection?
Right. So I was saying that there's two scientific bases, right? So one is this steep age gradient, and the second is the existence of lockdown arms. Again, I think there's not very little disagreement in the scientific community about both of those facts. If you put those facts together, the obvious policy is to protect the people who are at the most severe risk from the disease itself. And that's the idea of focus protection. That's the general principle of it. The actual implementation of it depends on the living circumstances of the people that are at risk, the resources that are available in the community, the technology that's available to do this. And so it's almost always going to be, in fact, it'll always be a local thing, because it'll depend on all of those things which are all local in nature, right? So one very, very obvious thing in a country like ours, where so many older people live in institutionalized settings, in nursing home settings, and that's where older, really vulnerable, chronically ill patients often live. It is, and this disease affects that group most commonly. It is absolutely vital to protect that group. We should have known that in February 2020 from the Chinese data. And we should have thought about that group as the key constraint in our policymaking. Instead, we thought about in March 2020 as hospital beds as the key constraint. Hospital beds and ventilator shortages, and we ran around trying to address that constraint. Like a linear programming problem, you figure out which constraint's binding, and you address that one thing, and then you go on to the next one, right? It's that one constraint. We said, okay, the constraint is hospital beds. That led to the decision in many of the Northeast states to send COVID-infected patients who were on the verge of looked like they were about to recover back to nursing homes, who then spread the disease all through there because they wanted to preserve the hospital beds.
Well, for somebody who loves numerical optimization, I love the way you frame this. But those are kind of connected, right? If you actually focus on protecting the vulnerable, you will also have the effect of not hitting the ceiling of the available.
That's the irony. If we protected the vulnerable are the most likely to be hospitalized, and so by protecting the vulnerable, we would also have addressed the shortage of hospital beds more effectively.
So that little shift in priority would have had a big impact. Okay, but specifically, the idea is to, and we could talk about different ideas of how to actually do this, but you basically do a lockdown or something like that on a very small set of people.
You may have to do that if its community spread is very high, but generally, I think it would depend on, again, the living circumstances so for instance, if you have here's a very simple idea that doesn't require a lockdown forced on them. I don't actually generally am not in favor of that kind of forced lockdown because you just won't get cooperation. Right. But what you could do is provide resources to that group of people. So imagine you live next door to somebody, an older couple, and there's high community spread. Well, they have to go grocery shopping. We did some communities did these senior only grocery hour. Right, but they still have to go out, and they might get exposed when they're shopping amongst other seniors.
Yeah.
Well, why not organize home delivery of groceries to them? We did that for the laptop class, right? Or we can even just as a volunteer effort. The older people living next door, just call them up and say, "Can I help you go out and go shopping for you?"
And so you would have potentially federal support of that kind of thing. So these kinds of efforts.
And identify where the vulnerable people live. It's really challenging in multi-generational homes. In LA County, for instance, there's a lot of older people living together with younger people in relatively crowded. It's really quite a challenge. But there again, you can use resources. So if grandma is worried that grandson has come home, is potentially been exposed, grandson calls grandma, says, I might have been at a party where COVID was. Grandma calls public health then says, okay, you can have this hotel room for a couple of days until you check turn negative.
So in case it wasn't clear, the idea of focus protection is the people that are vulnerable, protect them. and everybody else goes on with their lives, open up the economy, just do as it was before.
And there was still fear abroad, so there still would be some restrictions people would pose on themselves. They probably would go to parties less. The grandsons probably wouldn't go so many parties, right? There would be less participation in big gatherings. And you may even say like big gatherings in order to restrict community spread again. I'm not against any of that. But you shouldn't be closing businesses. You shouldn't be closing churches and synagogues. You shouldn't be forcing people to not go to school. You should not be shuttering businesses. You should just allow society to go on. Some disease will spread, but as we've seen, the lockdown didn't stop the disease from spreading anyways.
Right. So what do you make of the criticism that this idea, like all good ideas, cannot actually be implemented in a heterogeneous society where there's a lot of people intermixing, and once you open it up, people like the younger people will just forget that this is even existing, and they'll stop caring about the older people and mess up the whole thing, and the government will not want to fund any kind of the great efforts you're talking about food delivery, and then the food delivery services will be like, why the heck am I helping out on this anyway? Because like it's not making me much money. And so therefore, like all good ideas, it will collapse.
That might be true. I mean, I think it's always a risk with policy thing, but I think think back to the moment. Right? We actually felt like we were in this together to some extent.
Yes.
Right. I think that empathy that we had that was used to like tell people to stay in and like happily, not happily, but like stay in, to like wear a mask or to do all these things that we thought would help other people, could have been redirected to actually helping the people who most needed to be helped.
That's true. Especially, I do remember March. So this is even way before Barrington, all of that kind of stuff. March, April, May, there was a feeling like if we all just work together, we'll solve this.
Right.
And that maybe started to, when did that start breaking down? I mean, unfortunately, the election is mixed into this.
Yeah.
That it became politicized. But I think it lasted quite a long time.
I think into the summer, I think there was some of that sense. I don't know. It obviously varied among different people, but
Right.
But I think that it's true it would have been challenging. It's also true that it's heterogeneous, exactly the way you said. But what that means is you need a local response, a response. So my vision of a public health officer is someone that understands their community, not necessarily the nation at large, but their community, and then works within their community to figure out how to deploy the resources that they have available to do the kind of protection policies we're talking about. That's what should have happened. Instead, they spent a huge amount of efforts making sure businesses stayed closed. Businesses that, I mean, there are, like hardware stores that closed. What good did closing a hardware store do for the spread of COVID? If it had an effect on COVID spread, I mean, it's going to be more checking to make sure that plexiglass was put up everywhere, which now in retrospect turns out to probably made the disease worse. Masking enforcement, so shaming around masks. I mean, a huge amount of effort on things that were only tangentially related to focus protection. What if we turned our energy, that enormous energy put into that, instead into focus protection of the vulnerable? That's essentially the conversation I was calling for. And it wasn't, I mean, I didn't think of it as we had every single idea. I mean, we gave some concrete proposals, but the criticism we got was that those concrete proposals weren't enough. And the answer to that I have is that's true. They weren't enough. I wasn't thinking of them as enough. I was thinking that I wanted to involve an enormous number of people in local public health to help think about how to do focus protection in their communities.
The question that's interesting here is about the future too. So COVID has very specific characteristics, like you mentioned about the curve of the death rate based on it seems like with COVID, it's a little bit easier to actually identify a group of people that you need to protect. So other viruses may not be this way. So might lockdown be a good idea, like hardcore lockdown for a future virus that's 10 times deadlier? but spreads at the same rate as COVID. Or maybe another way to ask that is, imagine a virus that's 10 times deadlier. What's the right response?
I mean, I think it's always going to be focus protection, but the group that needs the focus protection may change depending on the biology of the virus, right? So the polio epidemic in the 40s and 50s in the US, the people at most risk were children. Yeah. We didn't know really at the beginning that it was this fecal oral spread. And so we did all kinds of crazy things, including like spraying DDT in communities, which was somehow supposed to get rid of polio. But the focus was on whenever there was an outbreak, they would close a school down. And that was the right thing to do because that group that needed protection was children, and the disease was spread, we thought, in schools. I don't think there's a single formula that works, but there's a single principle that works, right? No matter, it's hard to imagine a disease that's uniformly deadly across every group and every single person. There's always going to be some group that's differentially harmed. There's always going to be some group that's differentially protected. And that may change over time, right? So like in this disease, in this epidemic, as people got infected and recovered, we now had a class of people that were pretty well protected against the disease. Mm-hmm. They were like, instead of ostracizing them because they don't want a vaccine, we should be allowing them to work. I mean, we're having staffing shortages in hospitals now because we forgot that principle.
Is quite a bit of this a technology problem? So being able to, some of it, how much of it is a sociological problem? How much of it is a technology problem? Like, where do you put the blame, sort of, on why this didn't go so great, and how it can go great in the beginning?
I mean, think about lockdowns. Like, if we didn't have Zoom, we wouldn't have lockdowns. There's a reason in 2009 we didn't lock down. I mean, we didn't have the technology to replace work with this remote technology.
So we had good lockdown technology.
Yeah.
In Zoom, we didn't have good focus protection technology.
Yeah, I mean, focus protection is always going to be complicated, especially for something like this that spreads so easily. It's going to be complicated, and I'm the last person to say it would have been perfect. There would have been people that would have gotten sick, but they got sick anyways. The hope was that if we suppress community spread low enough, we can protect the vulnerable. That was the hope by lockdown. The reality was that only a certain class of people were able to benefit from lockdown. The rest of society, we call them essential workers, had to keep working, and they got sick.
Yeah.
And the disease kept spreading. It didn't actually have a substantial effect on community spread in non-laptop class populations.
And also, we should probably expand the class of people we call vulnerable to those who would suffer, who have the capacity to suffer, given the policies you're weighing. It's very disingenuous to call the vulnerable just the people. Obviously, we had the very specific meaning, but broadly speaking, vulnerable should include anybody who can suffer based on the policies you take in response to a virus.
I mean, that principle you just said, is I completely agree with, is something I think has been lost, and unfortunately lost, right? So the policies themselves, if they have harm, those are real, and we shouldn't pretend like they're not, and essentially demonize the people that suffer them, or pretend. I mean, like a lot of times, like the depression that we've been talking about, that's thought of as like not so important, but it is important, especially the harm to the people in poor countries. It's like been out of sight, out of mind in much of the rich parts of the world.
Once again, I have hope that we, seeing this, learning the lessons of history with the communication tools we have now, will learn this. It's like going to another country and bombing targeted terrorist locations, and there's going to be some civilians who die, pretending that the child who watches their dad die is not going to grow up, first of all, traumatized, but second of all, potentially bring more hate to the world than the hate that you were allegedly fighting in the first place. That's another sort of considering only one kind of harm and not the full range of harms that are being caused by your policies.
To return to focus protection, we still should be following the policy now for COVID, and we're not, right? So the vaccines, there's a great shortage in vaccines. You wouldn't know it in the United States and in the rich parts of the world, but there's a great shortage of vaccines. We're not going to be able to vaccinate the most of the the entire set of elderly, at least, or larger groups until late 2022. Huge numbers of older people around the world in poor countries that have not COVID recovered yet, so they're still quite vulnerable, have not had the vaccine. And yet we're talking about vaccinating 5-year-olds who benefit, if at all, from the vaccine of just a very little bit because they face such a low risk of harm from COVID.
Well, something that's a little bit near and dear to the two of our hearts. So you're at Stanford. So Stanford recently announced that they're going back to virtual, at least for some period of time, in response to maybe you can clarify, but I think it's in response to the escalated, how would they phrase it? It's related to Omicron. And a few other universities are kind of like considering back and forth. In my perspective, as somebody who loves in-person lectures, who sees the value of that to students, to young minds, also looking at the data, seems the risk aversion in university policies around this, given how healthy the student population is, seems not well calibrated. Let's put it this way. Also,
pathological.
Pathological is one way to put it. Given that, I believe, depending on the university, but I think many universities require that the student body is vaccinated at this point. So I think it's a big mistake by Stanford to do this. And I'd like to say that because I just hope MIT doesn't do it. But what are your thoughts about Stanford?
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think we have failed in our mission to educate our students by this decision. And I think, frankly, just more broadly, I think we failed generally over the course of the last year and a half in living up to our educational mission. In-person teaching is vital. Now, I can understand if you have older faculty, the principle of focus protection says provide some alternative teaching arrangements for them. That makes sense to me. From the kids' point of view, they're more harmed by not getting the education we promised them than by COVID. So applying this principle of this focus protection, let young professors teach in person. This is before the vaccine. After the vaccine, let everyone teach in person.
Yeah, this is the part I don't understand the discussion we're even having, because, okay, let's leave focus protection aside here, because that's a brilliant policy for the future when there's no vaccine. Now with the vaccine, I'm misunderstanding something here, because we're now in a space that's psychological. It's no longer about biology, because with the booster shots, which I believe MIT is now requiring before January, with the booster shots, the data shows no matter how old you are, the risks are very low for ending up in a hospital relative to all the other risks you face when you're older. I don't understand. Can you explain the policy around closing a university, but also just a policy about just being so scared still in the university setting?
I think the great universities have done great harm by modeling this kind of behavior.
Yes. To me, sorry to keep interrupting, but to me, the university should be the beacon of great behavior, not the beacon of like scared, conservative, let's not mess up, let's not make it pathological, let's not make anybody angry. It should be a place to play in the space of ideas.
Yes. So I think the central problem is actually related to the central problem of COVID policy more generally. The goal seems to be to stop the disease from spreading rather than to reduce the harm from the disease. if the goal is to stop the disease from spreading, the sad fact is we have no technology to accomplish that
at this point.
Yes,
because it's already deeply integrated into human civilization.
Well, I mean, it's here forever, right? There's a survey of white-tailed deer in the U.S. It turns out 80% of white-tailed deer in the U.S. have COVID antibodies. Dogs get it, cats get it. There's almost certainly human-animal transmission of it. I mean, presumably, I've heard bats get it apparently. So you have a situation where you have this disease that's here to stay.
Yeah.
And the vaccines don't stop the spread of it. The lockdowns don't stop the spread of it. We have no technology to stop the spread of it. And so we're burning the earth trying to do something that's impossible rather than working on what's possible. And so like letting regular college happen, that's a great good. Universities are a wonderful invention and it's contributed so much to society. To decide to shut it down, the universities should be fighting tooth and nail to not be shut down, not the other way around.
Yeah. Whatever the mechanisms that results in the universities doing that, this is me talking, it probably has to do with certain incentives for the administration, probably has to do with lawyers and legal kinds of things to avoid legal trouble. But once again, it's when the administration has too much power and too much definition of what the policy is for the university, that's when you get into trouble. The power of the university should be about the faculty and the students. Administration just gets in the way. Get out of the way.
I mean, they can help organize things. They play some important role, but they
certainly do.
But they need to remember what the mission is. The mission is not safety. The mission, actually, universities should be dangerous places, for ideas and whatnot.